This is APYouthNet.
Welcome to this special edition of the APYouthNet talk show, where we are in Bangkok with the Director-General of the ILO, Mr. Guy Ryder. DG, thank you so much for joining us on the APYouthNet talk show today.
It's a pleasure.
DG, we're here to talk about youth employment. And let's set the scene. We are in a situation where globally we still have 74.5 million young people unemployed. Young people remain 2 to 3 times more likely to be unemployed than adults. And if we think back 2 years ago at the ILC in 2012, the 185 member countries of the ILO got together and agreed on a resolution for youth employment. They agreed on this call for action, which talks about smarter macroeconomic and employment policies, labor market policies, education and skills training, self-employment and entrepreneurship, and rights at work. And yet, year after year, we see larger numbers, greater numbers of young people unemployed. Why is that according to you? What do you think that, that despite the determination, the ambition, the commitment, we still see those numbers rising?
You're absolutely right to point to this question. I think this is the question for the world of work today. 2 years later, the figures are no better than they were when we adopted that call for action in 2012. And you have to ask why. Now, the one thing I can say is if I sit in front of a Minister of Labour from those 185 member states, I can bet you that 9 out of 10, if I ask them, what is your number one problem, they'll say youth unemployment. So the political priority is absolutely clear. And yet, and you're absolutely right, we haven't been able to translate that political will into concrete results because the numbers are not coming down. Now, why is that? Not because I think the call for action was wrong. We identified the right things. We need a much more supportive macroeconomic environment for growth, and there's the real problem. The world economy is still not growing quick enough. There are more people coming onto the labour markets than there are jobs being created. So the pure mathematics of growth mean more young people are being squeezed out of the labour market. So we have to get that right. Then I think more and more countries are actually undertaking targeted measures for young people. If I look at Europe, you've got the Youth Guarantee Scheme. These are the right things to do. And then, as you pointed out, entrepreneurship. In many, particularly in the emerging world, entrepreneurship is seen as a really very valuable alternative for young people to get into the world of work. That's working. We're working very hard in the ILO to promote that option. Skills and training. We've got this incredible situation whereby employers tell us, in many cases, they can't find the right people to fill the jobs which are available. So we've got to get that supply and demand for skills right. One way to do that is apprenticeships, because in an apprenticeship, it's the employer who does the training, and the employer knows the skills they want. So we have to scale up apprenticeship schemes. And lastly, and we shouldn't forget it, we insist that young workers are workers like everybody else. They have the same rights as everybody else, and so we shouldn't cut corners on their rights when we try to get them into the labour market.
Now, DG, you have clearly put youth employment as a priority in your agenda. You have engaged into an unprecedented reform process. In the 2 years you have been DG. Can you give us just a few elements of that reform process, and particularly how, in your view, it can directly contribute to the youth or positively affect the youth?
Look, the overall aim of the reform process is to give the ILO more visibility, more influence, so that we have a bigger voice, a bigger influence in the world of work. Now, what does that mean for you young people? It means that we're developing greater knowledge on the types of schemes that actually work. I think that the real phrase is what works. People don't want speeches, they don't want theories. What are the policies that work? And part of our reform process is informing ourselves better on the things that work, and then developing the systems to deliver technical support to our constituents, to governments, to get them into the right, not just theoretical, but practical path to progress. Those two things. And the third thing I think is we've simply established youth unemployment as a key priority. The ILO has to prioritise. I think the danger for an organisation like ours is we try to solve every problem in the world of work, and you can't do it. You spread yourself too thin. So I want to gather together a critical mass of resources, of expertise, and a political will to respond to this crisis of youth unemployment.
So in this reform process, what would you say would have been your most difficult or most controversial decision, the one that you've had to make maybe in the past 2 years?
Yeah, you know, people ask me that. The most difficult thing is to set the agenda at actually the most difficult thing is to decide to stand and be a candidate as Director General. That was a difficult decision. And then you have to set an agenda. And I did that on the first day. On the first day, I published a commitment to reform in the ILO. And that was like a roadmap for me. And since then it's easy, because all you have to do is to decide to stay on the road. Now, it means the decisions themselves, they make themselves. They're obvious. It's difficult sometimes to announce them because you disappoint somebody or you get yourself into a political difficulty with some people. But when you know it's the right thing to do, to deliver on the agenda, actually the decisions are not so difficult.
And now if you had to name, related to that, maybe the key challenge of the ILO as you see it today, what would that be? Is it possible to name just one?
You know, I would say, let's just put jobs and youth employment to one side.
Yes.
Inequality. I think one of the things that disturbs me most about the world of work is it's generating greater and greater inequality in our societies. And I think everybody recognises that the levels of inequality that we suffer today is a danger in several respects. It's a danger to the social cohesion of our societies. You know, you can't live with this inequality. People get angry, and that creates instability. But as people are showing, the International Monetary Fund, for example, when you get to a certain level of inequality, it acts as a brake on growth. It stops growth because demand is not there. People haven't got money to spend. And so you get inequality feeding into lower growth rates, which cuts down on job creation, and it's a self-reinforcing cycle of unemployment and growing inequality. We have to break that vicious circle.
Now, talking precisely about this widening inequality, some economists come and tell us that the crisis is over or the best days are coming. In reality, we are talking about a multiplicity of crises, a financial, social, economic, even a climate crisis. But at the heart of that, isn't it that we have a youth employment crisis and an employment crisis? Now, what are your views on maybe the origins of the crisis? What do you have to also respond to those economists who are telling us that the crisis is over, that we are going to better days?
Well, the origins, let's start with the origins of the crisis. Financial sector meltdown. This was brought on, this is a crisis created by excess and poor regulation in the financial world. And by the way, we still haven't repaired that problem. In the G20, I listened to the chairman of the Financial Stability Board, the man who's doing the repair work to regulate the financial sector. He thinks the job is half done. So we should bear in mind that we haven't even solved that initial problem. But that's where the crisis had its origins. But very quickly, that financial crisis became a global social and labour crisis. There is an employment gap, a jobs gap of 76 million today. That is to say, it's a difference in the number of jobs in the world as they actually exist today compared to what would have existed had the crisis not happened and we'd carried on the same growth trends. So it's cost 76 million jobs. Now, is this crisis over? People talk about growth picking up. Well, growth is there in the global economy. It's very weak. It's certainly not enough to create the right number of jobs that we need. But I think, and I will quote the previous managing director in the International Monetary Fund, Strauss-Kahn, he said this crisis will not be over until we get all of those people who have lost their jobs back to work. Well, we're 76 million short of that. So this crisis is definitely not over. And I think the worrying thing is it shows signs of getting deeper rather than slightly more relaxed.
And so, of course, we have to deal with addressing this unemployment issue of the young people. And the ILO is the oldest institution of the United Nations. 1919 is when it was born. And at the same time, it makes it a very old organization that has to deal with the problems of the youth, of the young today. Is that a challenge? Is that incompatible or is it not?
Listen, the ILO, I think, faces the same challenge as nearly all public institutions. Young people are disillusioned. They don't really believe in politicians that much, because what answers are they bringing? They're not really joining political parties. There's a certain sort of feeling that these people are not for us. Now, the ILO, it would be a miracle if the ILO was an exception to that rule. So we face the same challenges as all other governments, political institutions, international organisations. I think we have to show our worth to young people, and that is a challenge. Now, how would I start to do that? How am I starting to do that? To show our mandate, say, look, this is what we're for. We're about social justice, fairness. We're about equality at work, defending people's rights. That's what young people, I think, care about. More and more, we're about the green economy, a sustainable future. Now, if we get those messages across, and we have to use the language that people understand, that people react to, I'm very, very sure, I'm very convinced that young people will join in. Young people will come on board. But we face that question of getting our message across in terms that young people will react to, and with a certain credibility as well. You know, international organisations are sometimes very distant from the everyday realities, even of working people who we're supposed to protect. So we have to work very, very hard at that contact that we make.
Isn't that a similar challenge to that the trade unions are facing? A world that you know very well, that they don't seem to be able to attract young people very well.
You're absolutely right. It resonates in exactly the same way.
Right.
But not just them. Young people joining political parties, they're certainly not joining the traditional political parties. They're looking for alternatives. They're looking for something new, something which they think is credible. Now, the ILO has to react in the same way as trade unions, exactly to that challenge. I happen to think we have the mandate, we have the role that young people will react to, but we have to do a better job of communicating why we are for them.
Now, looking at the future and the commitments, you have done an incredible job at securing an even larger, if I can say it that way, seat at the G20. Some work that was started with your predecessor, and now the voice of the ILO is increasingly heard. We have read the communiqué that comes from Brisbane, the leaders' meeting that you attended last month in November, and it's very strong. It's very strong on employment, it's very strong on youth employment, of course. Yes. Now the question, and maybe I play a little bit devil's advocate, but the question to you is, beyond the nice words and the right words of that communiqué, how do you think that the communiqué like this actually comes to affect positively the lives of the young people, the young job seekers?
Well, you're right to ask the question, devil's advocate or people's advocate. It's the right question. Now, let me say two things about it. I agree with you. It's a good communiqué. You know, the very first line of the communiqué, it's worth reading, just the first line, if you can't read 4 pages. It says, the highest priority is to promote growth for quality jobs for our people. It's the #1 priority. Goes back to what we said at the beginning. So it's a good one. It's a good text, but the absolutely necessary question to ask is, well, is it just a piece of paper? Is it just a piece of paper with no results? 2 things to say about that. Firstly, all of the countries in the G20 in the communiqué have signed up to national growth and employment strategies, which will be monitored by the G20. So they are being held accountable, and that's new in the G20, and might give us some hope that the words will be converted into actions. But we'll see. But I've got an even, I think, more powerful argument for the G20. The G20 began in 2008. It began when Lehman Brothers collapsed. Exactly. And there was this terrible fear that the whole financial system in the world was going to collapse and we'd enter into something which we haven't seen since the 1930s. It was really an unprecedented, in my experience at least, international reaction to an all-consuming crisis. The world said, my God, we better do something or we're in trouble here. And for 2 years, I would say up to let's say end of 2009, the G20 acted effectively to do 2 things. To stem the hemorrhaging of the financial system. The financial system did not completely implode, and it coordinated international action to pump finance into the global economy to save jobs. We saved a lot of jobs. The G20 saved a lot of jobs in the first year and a half. And then the sovereign debt crisis kicked in, the euro crisis kicked in, and we went from stimulus to austerity almost overnight. It was the G20 summit in Toronto that did that. And then somehow the G20, I think, lost the plot in respect of jobs. I think it has to recover that plot now, and it can do. It can do. I think the declaration from Brisbane last month was good. Turkey's taking over the G20 now. We've talked to them, and I think that they will also put jobs very high at the top of their agenda, and we do have a chance to make this communique that you've referred to more than just a piece of paper that's going on the shelf for filing.
Yes, and I've heard very encouraging news from the Prime Minister of Turkey, I think, in a discussion with you.
Yeah, we met him in Brisbane
yes.
to offer him the ILO's support, as we've supported the G20 under the Australian presidency. And I have to tell you, he was extremely receptive.
Yes.
And he made it very, very clear that jobs and good jobs are right at the top of the Turkish agenda. So the prospects are good, but we need that action.
And that will be a nice positive note to end the show. Director-General Guy Ryder, thank you so much for joining us on the APYouthNet talk show today. And please log on apyouthnet.ilo.org for more on youth employment in Asia and the Pacific. From Bangkok, thank you and goodbye.
This has been an APYouthNet production.